Officer Carter stood on the bustling sidewalk, scanning the faces in the late afternoon crowd. The streets hummed with the usual rhythm of the city honking horns, snippets of conversation, and the occasional bark of a street vendor calling for customers. Carter's gaze fell on a tall black man in a sharp navy blue suit, walking briskly down the street with a briefcase in hand. Something clicked in Carter's mind. The department bulletin from earlier that day described the suspect of a string of petty thefts, tall black male, 40s, wearing dark clothing. Though the man exuded an air of composure, Carter's instincts whispered that he matched the description. "Sir, hold it right there," Carter called, stepping into the man's path with an assertive hand raised. The man stopped, his expression calm but firm. His deep voice carried over the noise of the street. "Is there a problem, officer?" Carter's fingers hovered near his utility belt as he gestured for the man to step aside. "You fit the description of a suspect we're looking for. I'm going to need to ask you some questions." The man's brow furrowed, a mix of disbelief and restraint flickering across his face. "I believe there's been a mistake," he said evenly, his tone measured but resolute. "I've done nothing wrong." Carter crossed his arms, glancing over the man's suit and briefcase. His voice hardened, laced with the authority of his badge. "Mistake or not, I need your ID. Let's keep this simple." The tension between them grew as passersby slowed, their curiosity piqued. A few murmured among themselves, their eyes darting between the officer and the well-dressed man. "I'll cooperate," the man said after a pause, pulling out his wallet with deliberate slowness. He handed over his ID, meeting Carter's gaze with a calm but piercing intensity. "But I hope you understand the gravity of your actions." Carter ignored the remark, studying the ID. "David Brooks," he read aloud, glancing back up. "Let's take this down to the courthouse and clear things up." David's jaw tightened, but he gave a slight nod. "Lead the way," he said, his voice still steady, though a current of controlled frustration rippled beneath it. As Carter led David toward his squad car, the crowd began to disperse, but the weight of their silent stares lingered in the air. David, walking just behind the officer, glanced at the reflection of the city in the shop windows they passed. His composed exterior masked a storm brewing inside, a mix of indignation, resolve, and a profound sense of weariness. This wasn't the first time he had been judged by his appearance, but as he stepped into the squad car, he knew it wouldn't be the last. What Carter didn't know yet was that this moment would become far more significant than either of them could imagine. As Officer Carter escorted David Brooks toward the courthouse, the city seemed too slow, the scene drawing curious glances and murmured speculation. A small crowd had gathered, their faces etched with a mixture of confusion, intrigue, and unease. "What's going on over there?" A middle-aged woman whispered to her companion, shielding her mouth as she gestured subtly toward the pair. "Looks like they got someone," her friend replied, leaning in for a better view. "Must be serious. Dressed like that and all." The comments swirled, each one an unspoken judgment shaped by the scene before them. David's tailored navy suit and polished shoes seemed incongruous with the image of a petty thief, but the whispers persisted. "Tall black man in his 40s, someone murmured from the back of the crowd, echoing the vague description that had guided Carter's decision. "Guess that's enough these days." David walked with steady steps, his expression unreadable, as if years of experience had taught him the importance of composure in moments like this. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, a storm of emotions churned. He felt the weight of the crowd's stares and their unspoken questions, their assumptions cutting deeper than words ever could. Carter, meanwhile, kept his focus forward, his grip firm on David's arm. He felt the eyes on him too, but his resolve remained intact. He had a job to do, and in his mind, He was simply following protocol. A young boy tugged at his mother's hand, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "Mom, why's the policeman taking that man?" The mother hesitated, glancing from David to Carter, her voice lowering. "I'm not sure, honey," she said softly, her tone wary. David caught the exchange, his chest tightening at the child's innocent question. His eyes briefly met the mother's, and for a fleeting moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. As they reached the courthouse steps, the crowd began to disperse, though a few lingered, their curiosity lingering like a shadow. Carter guided David through the heavy doors, the echo of their footsteps filling the grand but impersonal space. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow, and the hum of activity was a stark contrast to the quiet tension of the street. Carter gestured for David to wait as he checked in with the court clerk. David stood tall, his posture unwavering as he scanned the room. To anyone observing, he appeared calm, almost detached, but inside, he was calculating his next move. He knew this was more than a misunderstanding. It was a moment that could expose a far deeper issue. The whispers from outside still echoed in his mind, each one a reminder of the assumptions that had led him here. His heart pounded not from fear, but from a simmering resolve to confront the injustice of it all. He glanced toward Carter, who was speaking with the clerk, his expression unreadable. David's eyes narrowed slightly as he prepared himself for what was to come. This was no longer about clearing his name, it was about something much bigger. The courthouse lobby was a cavernous space of marble floors and echoing voices, with the gravity of justice hung heavy in the air. Officer Carter guided David Brooks toward the courtroom, his demeanor unyielding as he informed the bailiff of their arrival. "Suspect fits the description of a theft case we're investigating," Carter explained to the bailiff, his voice brisk and official. David stood quietly, his hands clasped in front of him. His gaze swept the room, lawyers shuffling papers, court clerks hurrying past, and a few spectators whispering as they tried to place him. Despite the humiliation of the situation, David's calm never wavered. He had been in rooms like this countless times before, though never like this. The judge entered, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she settled into her seat. She tapped her gavel lightly, signaling for the proceedings to begin. Officer Carter took a step forward, addressing the judge. "Your Honor, we've brought in a suspect matching the description provided by witnesses: tall black male, mid-40s. He was apprehended earlier today based on this information." The judge looked at David, her expression unreadable. "Name?" she asked, her tone clipped but professional. David straightened his shoulders, his voice resonating with calm authority. "David Brooks, Your Honor. I'm a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice." A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly as she leaned forward. "A federal prosecutor. Yes, Your Honor," David replied, meeting her gaze directly. "And I can assure you, this is a misunderstanding. However, I believe it is one worth addressing in detail." Carter's face stiffened, a flicker of doubt flashing in his eyes. He turned to David, his earlier confidence shaken. You're with the Department of Justice? That's correct," David said evenly, though the weight of his words was palpable. "And I believe this incident speaks to larger issues than just a mistaken identity." The judge's gaze shifted between Carter and David, the tension in the room thickening with every second of silence. "Officer Carter," she said firmly, "on what grounds did you make this arrest?" Carter hesitated, his voice less assured. "The description, Your Honor." It matched. David raised a hand slightly, his expression still calm, but his voice carrying a sharp edge. "With all due respect, Your Honor, A vague description of tall black male in his 40s hardly constitutes probable cause. If it did, I fear countless innocent men would find themselves in situations like this simply because of their appearance. The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful as she folded her hands. The courtroom grew silent, every eye fixed on David. "This is not just about me," David continued, his voice steady but infused with conviction. "It's about the assumptions we make and the systems that allow those assumptions to go unchecked. I stand here today not just to clear my name, but to ask a question we must all grapple with. How often does this happen to men who don't have the title of federal prosecutor to shield them?" His words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone present. The judge's face softened slightly, though her voice remained composed. "Mr. Brooks, your point is noted. Officer Carter, this situation requires further review. Let's proceed carefully." David exhaled quietly, his calm demeanor masking the fire within him. This was no longer just about his own experience, it was about challenging a system that allowed bias to dictate outcomes. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint scratching of a clerk's pen on paper. All eyes were on David Brooks, who stood tall and unshaken, the weight of his words still hanging in the air. Officer Carter shifted uncomfortably, the authority he carried just moments ago now tempered by doubt. David took a deep breath, his voice cutting through the tension. "Your Honor, I've worked in law enforcement for nearly 2 decades. I understand the difficult decisions officers must make every day. However, I also know the dangers of allowing unchecked bias to dictate those decisions." The judge nodded slightly, signaling for him to continue. David turned his attention to Carter, his tone firm but measured. "Officer Carter, you saw me walking down the street a man in a suit, carrying a briefcase. Yet you decided I was a criminal based on one thing, a vague description. Tall, black, male, 40s. Tell me, officer, did you notice anything else about me? Did you consider verifying more details before detaining me?" Carter's jaw tightened, his gaze dropping momentarily. "I followed the description we were given," he replied, his voice less certain than before. "It was my job to investigate." David's eyes softened, though his resolve remained unshaken. "Investigate, yes. But did you ask yourself how many other men might fit that description? Did you look beyond the surface?" The room felt charged with an almost tangible energy. The judge leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "what would you suggest should have been done differently in this situation?" David turned to address her directly, his voice gaining strength with every word. "Your Honor, this case is about more than one mistaken arrest. It's about a pattern of assumptions that leads to unfair treatment of individuals based on their race. How many men like me have been detained or questioned because they happened to match a description that could apply to hundreds?" He gestured around the room, his hand trembling slightly from the weight of the moment. "I am fortunate, Your Honor. I have the resources, the education, and the title to defend myself. But what about those who don't? What about the young black men whose stories don't make it to a courtroom like this one? Their lives are disrupted, sometimes ruined, because of assumptions that go unchecked." The judge tapped her pen lightly on the bench, her expression thoughtful. "You're making a compelling argument, Mr. Brooks," she said. David pressed on, his voice growing more impassioned. "Your Honor, I am not standing here to demand an apology for myself. I'm standing here because this system needs to change. We need to train officers to look beyond the surface, to question their assumptions, and to rely on evidence, not stereotypes." Carter shifted again, the reality of the moment sinking in. The courtroom felt like it was holding its collective breath, every person hanging on David's words. David's gaze returned to Carter, his tone softening but remaining resolute. "Officer Carter, I don't blame you for doing your job. But I do challenge you to ask yourself why you made the decision you did. What led you to believe I was guilty without considering who I might truly be?" Carter's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The judge glanced at him, then back to David. "Mr. Brooks, you've raised critical points. This court will take them into serious consideration as we move forward." David nodded, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. He had said what needed to be said, but he knew the real battle wasn't in this courtroom, it was out there, in the hearts and minds of people who needed to see the world differently. The judge's gavel tapped lightly, signaling a pause as she leaned back in her chair. The courtroom, charged with tension, fell into a moment of reflection. David Brooks stood firm, his gaze steady, yet his voice carried a weight that pulled everyone into the depths of his argument. "Your Honor," David began, shifting slightly to address not just the judge, but the entire room. "This isn't only about my experience today. It's about a broader issue that we, as a society, continue to ignore. Vague descriptions, like the one that brought me here, are not just incomplete, they're dangerous." He turned toward Officer Carter, his tone neither accusatory nor harsh, but probing. "Officer Carter, can you recall how many other men in this city could be described as a tall black male in his 40s? 100? 1,000? Carter hesitated, clearly struggling for an answer. David nodded knowingly, his voice softening but never losing its edge. "That description could fit countless men who, like me, have families to go home to, careers they have built, and dreams they're working toward. Yet, too often, they find themselves interrupted, judged, or even harmed because of assumptions rooted in something as arbitrary as their height, their skin, or the way they walk down the street." The judge adjusted her glasses, her face betraying a flicker of empathy. David continued, his words imbued with emotion. "I've spent years as a federal prosecutor, Your Honor. I've seen the statistics. Black men are disproportionately stopped, questioned, and detained based on incomplete or vague descriptions. These moments disrupt lives sometimes permanently. Jobs are lost, reputations are tarnished, and communities grow more divided. And for what? For a momentary assumption, often based on fear rather than fact." The room remained silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. David paused, glancing around at the faces before him, the clerks, the judge, even the quiet spectators in the back rows. He wanted them to feel the truth of what he was saying, not just hear it. "Your Honor," he said, his voice lowering but gaining intensity, "these are not just statistics to me. They are people. They are stories. They are families who sit around dinner tables, wondering why their son, their father, or their brother was stopped on his way home. And worse, they are the families who never get that loved one back." A young court clerk shifted uncomfortably, her expression softening as David's words seemed to strike a personal chord. Even Officer Carter's stance began to loosen, his rigid demeanor giving way to something more introspective. David took a deep breath, the fire in his eyes still burning. "I am here today, not just to defend myself, but to advocate for those who don't get this chance. To challenge the systems and the perceptions that allow moments like this to happen over and over again." He looked directly at the judge, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about fairness, Your Honor. It's about justice. And justice cannot exist in a system that relies on stereotypes instead of evidence." The judge rested her hands on the bench, her expression contemplative. "Mr. Brooks, your words carry weight," she said finally, her tone measured but respectful. "We must address these issues, not just in this courtroom, but in the broader systems that govern us. Please proceed." David nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spoken his truth, but he knew this moment was just one step in a much larger fight. As he glanced toward Officer Carter, he saw the faint beginnings of reflection in the officer's eyes, a glimmer of the change he hoped to ignite. The courtroom felt charged, the air heavy with an unspoken shift. David Brooks remained composed, his calm exterior masking the intense focus within. He knew this was the moment to drive his point home, to force reflection, not just from Officer Carter, but from everyone in the room. He turned to Carter, his expression thoughtful but unwavering. "Officer Carter, may I ask you something?" His tone was direct yet disarming, inviting conversation rather than confrontation. Carter hesitated, the tension clear in his stiff posture. "Go ahead," he replied, his voice quieter now, almost cautious. "Before you detained me," David began, his words deliberate, "did you know I was a federal prosecutor?" Carter blinked, caught off guard by the question. "No," he admitted, his tone flat. "I didn't." David nodded slowly, allowing the weight of the admission to sink in. "Exactly," he said, his voice steady but tinged with restrained emotion. "You acted on a description, one so vague it could have applied to dozens, maybe hundreds of men in this city. You didn't stop to consider who I might be. You didn't ask any clarifying questions. You assumed." The word hung in the air like a gavel strike, its impact rippling through the room. Carter shifted his weight uncomfortably, his gaze dropping for a moment before meeting David's again. David continued, his voice growing firmer. "Now, imagine if I wasn't a federal prosecutor. Imagine if I didn't have the resources or the knowledge to stand here and defend myself. Would you have listened to me then? Or would you have dismissed me as just another suspect, another face in the crowd that fit the description?" The judge leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied Carter's reaction. Even the spectators seemed to hold their breath, their expressions a mix of curiosity and quiet reflection. Carter opened his mouth to respond but faltered, his words caught somewhere between defense and doubt. David stepped closer, his tone softening but losing none of its intensity. "Officer Carter," he said, his voice almost gentle, "this isn't just about what you did. It's about why you did it. You're part of a system that teaches you to prioritize suspicion over understanding, speed over accuracy, and assumptions over evidence. That system failed me today. But how many others has it failed before me? How many more will it fail after?" Carter's lips pressed into a thin line, his silence speaking louder than words. David turned back to the judge, his expression resolute. "Your Honor, this isn't just about holding one officer accountable. It's about addressing the culture that allows moments like this to happen. We can't change the past, but we can choose to change how we move forward. And that starts with acknowledgement, with seeing these moments not as isolated incidents, but as part of a larger pattern we must break." The judge tapped her pen lightly against the bench, her face unreadable. "Mr. Brooks," she said finally, her voice carrying an edge of respect, "your point is clear. This court will consider how best to address the situation, not just for you, but for the greater good." David exhaled quietly, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was progress. And sometimes progress was the most anyone could hope for. As he glanced at Carter, he caught a flicker of something unexpected, perhaps regret, perhaps understanding. It was a small moment, but to David, it mattered. Change always began with recognition, no matter how reluctant. The judge's expression was measured, her gaze sweeping across the room. She took a moment to organize her thoughts, her fingertips lightly tapping the bench as the silence grew heavier. All eyes were on her, waiting for the decision that would follow. Finally, her voice broke the tension. "Officer Carter," she began, her tone steady but pointed, "it's clear from today's discussion that there were missteps in your actions. While I believe there was no malicious intent, the consequences of your choices speak to a deeper issue within our justice system, an issue we cannot afford to ignore." Carter shifted slightly, his shoulders tense, but his face impassive. "Mr. Brooks," the judge continued, turning her attention to David, "your argument has been both compelling and necessary. You've highlighted not just a personal grievance, but a systemic flaw that demands our attention." David nodded once, his expression calm but resolute. He knew this moment was about more than vindication. It was about laying the groundwork for meaningful change. The judge leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "To that end, this court orders the following. Officer Carter, you will undergo mandatory implicit bias training and community engagement programs designed to foster greater understanding and reduce reliance on assumptions in the line of duty." A murmur rippled through the room, the weight of the decision settling over the spectators. Carter's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the judge. "In addition," she said, her voice firm, "Officer Carter, you will submit a formal written apology to Mr. Brooks, acknowledging the error in your actions and the broader implications of this incident." Carter's face twitched, perhaps with frustration, perhaps with shame, but he nodded curtly. David's expression softened slightly, though his posture remained upright. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but infused with gratitude. "This is a step in the right direction. But if I may," the judge gestured for him to continue, her brow raised in curiosity. David turned to Carter, his tone gentler than before. "Officer Carter, this isn't about punishment. It's about growth. We all carry biases, myself included, but it's what we do when those biases are brought to light that defines us. This moment isn't just a chance to correct a mistake. It's an opportunity to set an example for others." Carter met David's gaze for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he gave a small nod, though he said nothing. The judge cleared her throat, drawing the attention back to her. "This court also recommends a review of departmental policies regarding detentions based on vague descriptions. I will personally ensure this recommendation is forwarded to the appropriate oversight committees." The weight of her words settled over the room, signaling the magnitude of the decision. David felt a flicker of hope, a small light amidst the frustration and weariness that had brought him to this moment. It wasn't everything, but it was something. And something, he knew, was how change began. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the session. "This court is adjourned." As the courtroom began to stir with movement, David remained still for a moment, his thoughts racing. He had come here to clear his name, but the resolution carried far more meaning than he had anticipated. He glanced at Carter, who lingered near the exit, his posture less rigid than before. David exhaled deeply, his mind already focused on the path ahead. Change wouldn't come overnight, but today had shown that even small steps could shift the tide. The courtroom emptied slowly, the weight of the judge's decision lingering like a ripple in still water. David Brooks gathered his belongings, his movements deliberate, as if savoring the quiet victory of the moment. His heart, however, remained heavy with the knowledge that this was only the beginning. As he walked toward the door, he caught sight of Officer Carter, standing to the side, his posture less rigid than before. For the first time since their encounter began, Carter's expression wasn't defensive, it was contemplative, even hesitant. David paused, considering whether to engage. He knew the significance of this moment, not just for Carter, but for the broader conversation they had inadvertently stepped into. Finally, he approached, his steps calm but purposeful. "Officer Carter," David began, his voice steady yet kind. "I wanted to thank you for staying." Carter looked up, his eyes shadowed with something that resembled regret. "I owe you more than that," he admitted, his voice low. "This wasn't how I wanted today to go." David nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Mistakes happen. What matters is how we learn from them." Carter shifted his weight, glancing toward the courtroom door as if searching for the right words. "I didn't see it before," he said finally, his tone raw. "I didn't think about what it must feel like to be judged like that, to have your life interrupted because someone assumes the worst. I thought I was doing my job, but—" He trailed off, his voice thick with emotion. David softened, his voice carrying the wisdom of years spent advocating for justice. "It's not easy to confront our own biases, Officer Carter. But recognizing them is the first step. This isn't about pointing fingers, it's about building trust, one decision at a time." Carter looked at him, something shifting in his expression. "You could have torn me apart in there," he said quietly. "But you didn't." "Why?" David considered the question, the weight of his answer pressing heavily on him. "Because change doesn't come from tearing people down," he replied. "It comes from understanding, from having the hard conversations, and from showing grace when it's needed most. If I tore you down, it wouldn't fix the system, it would just make the gap between us wider." Carter nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing as the words sank in. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean that." David extended a hand, his gesture one of reconciliation rather than victory. "We all have work to do, Carter," he said. "Let's start here." Carter hesitated for only a moment before shaking David's hand firmly. The brief exchange carried more weight than either man could put into words, a small but meaningful step toward understanding. As David walked away, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long, but moments like this reminded him why the fight mattered. Outside the courthouse, the world seemed brighter, the noise of the city a reminder of the lives that continued despite the battles fought within its walls. David paused at the top of the courthouse steps, taking in the view with a deep breath. In the distance, he could see a young boy holding his mother's hand, the same boy who had questioned why David was being detained. The boy's eyes met David's, wide with curiosity, and David offered a small nod and a reassuring smile. This, he thought, is why we keep pushing forward for the next generation, for a world where assumptions no longer dictate outcomes. David Brooks stepped away from the courthouse, the sound of the heavy doors closing behind him a faint echo. The cool breeze brushed against his face, carrying with it a strange mixture of relief and determination. As he descended the steps, he felt the weight of the day settle in his chest, a day that, despite its challenges, carried the seeds of change. A few reporters had gathered outside, their cameras poised, their questions sharp and eager. David paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping over them. He wasn't seeking attention, but he understood the power of this moment. He adjusted his suit jacket and approached the small crowd, his expression composed but resolute. "Mr. Brooks," a reporter called out, her voice cutting through the chatter. "How do you feel about the judge's decision today?" David met her gaze, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Today's decision is a step forward, not just for me, but for the countless others who have faced similar situations without the privilege of being heard. What happened to me is not unique. It's a reflection of a system that still has much work to do." Another reporter leaned in, her pen hovering over a notepad. "Do you believe justice was served?" David paused, his eyes narrowing slightly in thought. "Justice," he said slowly, "is not a single moment. It's not just about a courtroom decision or a written apology. True justice is a process. It's about accountability, education, and a willingness to confront the biases that shape our world. Today's verdict is a start, but it's not the end. The reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras capturing every word. David continued, his voice growing stronger. This isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about a system that allows assumptions to dictate actions, a system that too often fails to recognize the humanity in everyone it serves. If we want real change, we need to hold ourselves accountable, not just in our professions, but in our daily lives. We need to ask hard questions, challenge our biases, and refuse to accept status quo. A hush fell over the crowd, his words resonating deeply. Even those who had simply stopped to watch seemed captivated, their expressions a mix of thoughtfulness and quiet agreement. David looked around, his gaze settling on a young man standing near the back. The man wasn't a reporter. He was just a bystander, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Their eyes met, and the man gave a small nod, a gesture of solidarity that carried more weight than words. David turned back to the reporters, his tone softening but remaining resolute. This isn't just my fight. It's all of ours. Whether you're wearing a badge, sitting behind a desk, or simply walking down the street, we all have a role to play. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with moments like this, moments where we choose to do better, to be better. With that, he stepped away, signaling that the questions were over. The crowd of reporters began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the city's hum. David exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the day lift slightly. As he walked toward the sidewalk, a woman approached him cautiously, her young son in tow. It was the same boy who had watched his arrest earlier, his wide eyes now filled with curiosity and something deeper, admiration. "Mr. Brooks," the woman said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to say thank you. What you said in there. It mattered. It matters to people like us." David crouched slightly, meeting the boy's eyes. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "James," the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Well, James," David said, his tone warm but firm, "always remember this. You are more than what people assume about you. You have the power to define who you are, no matter what anyone says." The boy smiled shyly, his mother squeezing his shoulder in quiet gratitude. As they walked away, David straightened, his heart swelling with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. But today, he had taken a step forward. And sometimes that was all it took to begin a movement. David Brooks walked through the bustling streets, the courthouse shrinking behind him as the city's life enveloped him. The weight of the day clung to him, but so did a quiet sense of resolve. He had taken a stand not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced or dismissed by a system that demanded change. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it for the moment. This was a time for reflection, a chance to process the waves of emotions that had coursed through him since his encounter with Officer Carter. As he reached the park at the edge of downtown, David found a bench under the shade of a sprawling oak tree. He sat down, his gaze drifting to the children playing on the swings and the families enjoying the crisp afternoon. Their laughter was a soothing reminder of the world he was fighting to protect, a world where fairness and dignity should be universal, not privileges for the few. David pulled out his phone and opened his notes app, his fingers pausing over the screen. Words began to flow, unfiltered and raw, capturing the essence of the day's events. Justice is not a single act, nor is it a final destination. It is a journey, a collective commitment to seeing one another fully and treating each other with the dignity we all deserve. Today was a step forward, but the road ahead is long. Change starts with conversation, but it flourishes with action. Let us not stop here. He saved the note, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had no doubt the words would be part of something bigger, an article, a speech, or even just a post shared widely enough to spark meaningful dialogue. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir." David looked up to see a young man in his early 20s standing nearby, his expression hesitant but earnest. "I just wanted to say I saw you on the news," the man said. "What you said, it really spoke to me. I've had my own experiences, and, well, I just wanted to say thank you." For standing up, David's heart swelled, a warm wave of emotion washing over him. He extended a hand, which the young man shook firmly. "Thank you for saying that," David replied. "We all have a part to play in this. Keep sharing your story. It's how we keep the momentum going." The young man nodded, his eyes gleaming with gratitude, before walking away. David watched him go, his steps lighter than they had been moments ago. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the park, David leaned back on the bench. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the city fill his senses. He thought of Officer Carter, the judge, the mother and her son, the reporters, and the countless others who would hear his story. Each one represented a piece of the puzzle, a collective effort to create a better, more equitable world. David stood, his resolve firm. This was only the beginning. There were still conversations to be had, laws to be changed, and hearts to be opened. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time. Walking away from the park, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges ahead were daunting, but he knew that with every story shared and every assumption challenged, change was not just possible, it was inevitable. The words of the day played in his mind like a quiet mantra. Justice is a journey. Let us all keep walking.